So, just listening to the presentations which we've heard so far, I'm sort of starting to see sort of an ongoing argument and maybe a discussion around performativity. And I think the performativity of the data and the performativity of the research and the performativity of the digital. We've heard about it this morning from Robin, and we've talked about this, and Robin very much made the argument of the performativity of the digital and the imaginaries which drive that, that performance, and Mirko has reflected, I think, on the political economy of that particular performance. And how it needs to be situated. And I think the message which which comes out of these presentations, and which will also come out of my presentation, is how incredibly important it is to be self-reflexive in how we analyze, how we collect, how we potentially also curate these data, which is a completely different, I guess, a completely different stage and phase, which we haven't really gotten to, but I think we could talk about this. So this project attempts to do precisely that, think about the complications of preserving, analyzing, and curating cultural and political practices on a hyper-commercial platform. And Mirko has already sort of set the stage for this. At the same time, it tries to show why it's interesting and worthwhile to do so. This is very much actually a sort of guerrilla project, you could say, not working with a commercial data reseller. So let's get into it. So it discusses this Facebook page, which was set up in early 2010 by Wael Ghonim, who was at the time the Dubai head of marketing for Google Middle East and North Africa. And he created the Collina Khaled Said Facebook page, which is in the West known as We Are All Khaled Said Facebook page. And the page was set up and developed with the help of a few others to protest against the murder of Khaled Said, who was a middle-class Egyptian man living in Alexandria, who was allegedly, and actually it turned out to be true, beaten to death by the Egyptian security forces. And his death in the summer of 2010 and subsequently became a symbol of Egyptian police brutality and state repression. The page received no less than 250,000 likes during the first 3 months of its existence, and a like means that those who've liked it can see updates of the page on their own feed. It rapidly developed subsequently into a stage where especially young middle-class Egyptian youth shared their grievances about the Mubarak regime, and that's been documented in quite a few studies on this. Moreover, it also became a springboard for mobilizing offline street protests. First, in the summer of 2010 itself, on quite a small scale, a couple of hundred people engaged in silent stands in Alexandria. But subsequently, in early 2011, was the place where the call for the protest on the 25th of January 2011 was first launched, precisely at the moment when the Ben Ali regime fell in Tunisia. And there's of course a lot of correspondence between the two events. In response to that call, tens of thousands of users of the page actually said that they would attend and join these protests. So we've collected with a team of 5 people from media studies in Amsterdam and the Arabic language department, which was very essential in terms of participating in this project, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to translate all of the material we gathered. Neither could we really interpret it in a proper way. So from the University of Amsterdam and the American University in Cairo, we've collected all of the data exchanged through the entire lifetime of the page, from June 2010 until July 2013, which amounted to 14,000 posts by the admins, 7 million comments, and sent by 1.8 million users. And here you can see the comment activity during the first year of the page, which was a special year which we focused on. And I will come back to this graph later on. All this data was collected and automatically anonymized, which again is an important feature of the NetVis data extraction tool which we use for this project. NetVis has been developed and maintained by Bernard Rieder, which both me and Mirko have worked with. He was one of the members of the research team. And on the basis of this research, the presentation discusses the analytical opportunities and problems presented by very large Facebook pages. And it takes a dive into the complexities and also the intrigue of social media data. And this, of course, should provide the base for further reflecting on what we could potentially do with this kind of data. So I'll do so through the following steps. I will first talk about collecting data through Facebook API, which is indeed a really problematic exercise, which Mirko already alluded to, and I'll talk more extensively about this. I will talk about some of the analytical strategies which are potentially open when working with this data, and then I'll talk about a case study which we've done. We're doing actually a couple of cases, but this one has already been published on the transformations in leadership, protest leadership, which we're seeing taking place through the development of social media communication. So, collecting data through Facebook's API. So researchers, as you're probably aware of, have investigated now for a couple of years already sets of social media data, especially from Twitter, sometimes also from Facebook and YouTube, especially Twitter, because Twitter data was and is still most easily collected, whereas Facebook data is much more complicated. And they've used that to gain insight on how platforms play a role in specific domains, such as political activism, which I've done a lot of research on, public debates, Mirko talked about a few of them, disaster communication, another field, journalism, and there are a variety of fields where this data has been used. As well as, of course, to gain insight on how particular events in these domains have unfolded, using social media data to trace these events, sort of as a window onto these events. So, application programming interfaces, the APIs, provided by the platforms themselves. So these are, as I said, commercial platforms, of course, are typically used for collecting data by researchers. And as such, APIs can be considered as what we call technical passage points in social media research. APIs are meant for programs to interact with each other, and social media companies provide them so other companies and third-party developers can develop a sort of application ecosystem which sort of enhances the value of that platform by allowing a wide variety of types of apps to interact with, for example, the Facebook platform. As a side effect, this is really a side effect, I would say, APIs provide seemingly robust and convenient access to vast data pools for research purposes. At the same time, APIs are usually not designed to accommodate the needs of researchers. So they're not specifically designed for this. And they pose a series of problems, and we'll talk about these a bit. So what we need to do, this is the first moment of sort of self-critical reflexivity. We need to conceive of the logics behind computational techniques as a fundamental part of the knowledge production process. Just as, for example, as you're used to, at least people trained in sociology or anthropology, are used to think about the design and distribution of a questionnaire. So simply put, the API is just as much part of the knowledge production process as a questionnaire or an interview is. When we look in detail at how data is accessed through the Facebook API, we encounter a number of complications. So these are complications we have struggled with. Already accessing the data through the API is far from straightforward. So a few months after we collected these millions of comments and thousands of posts, NetVis, our data extraction tool, was blocked by Facebook and could only be reinstated after particular features for personal data export had been removed. And during this period, of course, it was impossible to collect data. Facebook and other platforms are constantly going through these kinds of changes. So they're constantly changing how their API works and to what extent you can access particular types of data from their platform. Furthermore, of course, it should be noted that Facebook policies officially prohibit exporting data collected through the API. So in this sense, there is a direct conflict between this type of research and Facebook policies, even though the platform effectively allows researchers to work with this type of data. So here we are again looking at a spreadsheet, which we did before. So beyond such fundamental legal issues, the API limits, and that's very important to keep in mind, limits the detail of information which can be obtained about user activity on the page, which in turn then limits the analytical possibilities of how social media communication can be analyzed or visualized. So here you can see part of a spreadsheet of the typical kind of spreadsheet which we work with, of the data obtained on the most engaged with post on the page. The translations have been provided by us, so they're not provided by Facebook, evidently. As you can see, the API provides type of post, so status update and photo, the message itself, and when it was posted, and the numbers of likes, comments, and shares of the post. Furthermore, the comments provided in separate files are time-stamped and attributed to individual users. So if the tool wouldn't anonymize them, we could actually reconstruct the particular person. And the content of the comment is provided. So that's actually great data to work with. The likes are, however, missing the temporal component, so we don't know when somebody liked something. And the shares are just a count. And that's important because likes and shares are an indication of user engagement. So it's kind of an indication of what users find important, what they find interesting. But the missing temporal data makes it just very difficult to work with these kinds of indicators, as many users might have liked a post many months after it was posted, which is actually, in this particular case, frequently happens. So we found posts which were commented on months or even years after it was posted. And people really literally had to go back on the page for a long time to actually comment on that particular post. Which is important in these kind of really culturally resonating and politically important kind of pages. Okay, a second issue is completeness, and that's something Mirko also talked about before. While Facebook seems to provide complete access to page data, the question is more complex, and it appears at first glance. For each post on a page, the API provides the list of likes and comments containing the usernames and the identifiers, etc. But when comparing the count of the likes and comments, it doesn't correspond with what we actually collected. So in most cases, what we collected was substantially lower than the actual count provided by Facebook. So there was data missing. On average, was 7% lower likes we collected and 23% lower counts of comments. So about 23% of all of the comments on every post was missing. And of course, we can guess about the explanations for this. The admins might have deleted quite a few comments, and it could also have been that heavy commenters have deleted their accounts, but that's all speculation. But the message, the sort of central message is, you never have a complete data set, and you never know why. You never know why that is. And that, I would say, is probably true for all social platforms. All right. A third issue is Facebook's complex architecture. So certain features are not directly embedded in a post. Consequently, crucial user activity may happen elsewhere. For example, when a page administrator creates a new Facebook event, a key feature of the platform, an announcement of a post is created, but commenting and liking and sharing mostly happens on the event page, on another part of the platform, which means that you have to separately start to collect data for that. And that's very similar to kind of the problem which Mirko discussed in terms of hashtags, where hashtags change and you constantly have to follow where event or activity takes place. So while none of these issues precludes making interesting and deep findings, so you can still work with all of the data and still interesting, I will show in the next part of my talk, they force us, as I will show in the next part, they force us to critically reflect on the data we have collected before we engage in any type of analysis or potentially visualize this data or in the context of a museum or elsewhere. So there needs to be this constant critical reflection of what are we actually collecting and how are we collecting it and how does the architecture structure this. So that brings me to analytical strategies which sort of need to take that into account. So the fundamental point here, and that goes also into curating this type of data and then maybe visualizing it. So working with social media data means that the available options for analysis are already for a large extent predefined. So the available options for analysis are already to a large extent predefined. There are large amounts of well-structured data to be collected, but researchers have little to no influence on the actual elements made available, which I already talked about quite a bit before. So many projects studying online activity, in particular those following a classic sort of waterfall type research strategy, where the inquiry starts with a particular research question, they're quite unsuitable for this type of data collection through APIs. At least not without finding additional data to actually address those kind of questions, because you're provided with very specific data elements which only require you to produce particular types of insights. So the predefined nature and complexity of social media data often calls for a more open-ended analysis, or what my colleague Bernard Rieder calls numerical detective work, which means that theoretical concepts are brought in and developed in conversation with the data. So and I think that idea of conversation with the data is very important. And we might want to think about that further if we think about performativity of the digital, critically reflecting on what we're collecting and analyzing, and then maybe how we would develop such a conversation. So let me highlight how this type of numerical detective work and kind of conversation can proceed and what kind of insights it can produce. So starting with the users, in terms of numbers, is over 2 million people liked the page, which means that they could see updates. And of these 4 million people, about 1.8 million liked or commented at least once on a post on the page. And about these 1.8 million, we can say further things. So we can't say anything about 2.2 million, which also liked the page, but didn't do anything with it. So they didn't comment on it or like particular posts. What we know from self-reported data, and here we go again into this territory of a little bit of the unknown, self-reported data, about 63% claimed to be man and 35% claimed to be female. Of course, some users lie about their gender, but overall, that is at least it gives a rough indication of gender balance on the page. And the primary language of the users, and there we get immediately into further trouble, which is determined on the basis of the chosen interface language of the on the Facebook page. You would think that this is very much an English-dominated page, but that's really highly questionable. And the reason being for a couple of reasons. First, the Arabic Facebook interface was only created in 2009, and many users started to use Facebook before, but in an English setting, and they probably never changed that setting. But a stronger indicator of why this is more of what we think is an Egyptian and an Egyptian affair is that virtually all content on the page was written in Arabic. So all of the comments, all of the posts were written in Arabic, and many of them also in Egyptian dialect. And the third one, when Mubarak famously ordered the internet to be shut down in Egypt, the number of comments and likes dropped dramatically. And here we get to this one, Let me see if I can, okay, I can, oh yeah, I can. So you see, do you see this? This is where, in the middle of everything, so this is around the end of January, there's a dramatic drop in likes and comments. And this is precisely the moment when Mubarak or the regime cut the internet, which suggests to us that most of the users were actually in Egypt at the time. Which is very different, by the way, for example, from Twitter. So Twitter and the tweets about, for example, hashtag Egypt, many of the users were outside. Yeah. So I need to go quicker. So let me just first talk about one of the ways in which we engaged with all of that data. So all of these millions of comments. And one of them was through a tool which plots the relative and absolute frequency of particular terms used in the comments. And what you can say, it's probably too small from the back. But what you basically can see is we've color-coded these, that in the first period, so this scans all of the millions of tweets which are exchanged around the posts. And what you can see there is that in the beginning of the period, right after Khaled Said was murdered, there was lots of comments on torture, police brutality. Whereas eventually, when the page evolved, especially also around the time of the uprising, there was lots of comments on corruption. So you're slowly seeing sort of the character or the focus of the comments changing. So the idea here is that we use the data as a window onto popular sentiment in Egypt. It's sort of a window onto this. More generally, of course, the idea is that social media data can be used as such a window onto evolving public sentiments, which is an interesting idea, I think. But of course, important always to keep in mind that it's a particular type of window, which is developed within a very specific techno-commercial infrastructure. The second way in which we looked at this was through qualitative analysis of the posts and the comments itself. And what we did, we selected those which the users engaged with most, which the users commented on the most or liked the most, and we said, well, this is the type of data they find important. So it's a kind of user-generated way of selecting data from a very large set. And then we translated for every day the 3 most commented on posts and the 10 comments on those posts. So then we had a set of sort of posts and comments to look at and to further analyze. And then, let me just very briefly talk about this. We looked at the interaction between the administrators, so Wael Ghonim and some of his collaborators, and the users. And we tried to think about this in terms of leadership. So to what extent is this a new form of leadership? So this is the type of question you could ask. So you can also look at to what extent are these users, for example, developing new citizen practices on this platform, which would be another interesting question, also one we're looking at. So can they be thought of in such a way? It's actually a problematic proposition from a more traditional social movement perspective, because there was no social movement organization involved. They did not have followers in the traditional sense of the word, and they didn't really self-recognize or self-identify themselves as leaders. They tried to remain anonymous, which worked for a long time, until the moment Wael Ghonim was imprisoned around the start of the uprising. But we were interested in this because there's been suggestions that these kind of Facebook administrators and top Twitter users are acting something like leaders. And a term which has been used is the term connective leadership, sort of an information type of leadership. But no real detailed studies have been done on this type of leadership. And this type of data obviously allows you to do that type of analysis, because you can follow very precisely in detail how this interaction between administrators who posted, who were the only ones who could post, and users who commented on these posts, how this interaction unfolded. And so that's what we've done. And again, this takes place within this very particular socio-technical configuration. set by the Facebook page, which, for example, allows only the administrators to post comments and allows users only to react to those comments by liking and commenting. But important is also actually that this Facebook develops these pages as marketing instruments. So they're specifically, well, advertised as marketing instruments. And that's also how Wael Ghonim, who was trained in marketing, conceived of it. So he talked about the Khaled Said Facebook page as a brand, as something you develop as a brand, which is inclusive and which goes beyond also traditional Egyptian politics. So the way he did that then, he developed very much this non-partisan, inclusive rhetoric around Egyptian politics. And one of the ways we saw that is in reaction to the bombing of a Coptic church at the beginning of January 2011, which caused a lot of uproar and could potentially have led to a lot of religious strife. And what the administrators kept emphasizing is that this is an act of terrorism against the whole Egyptian people and that they needed to be united as such. Another moment in which I think is very clearly a form of marketing activism is the way they've advertised the 25th of January as a day to protest, using the Obama slogan of "Yes, we can," and at the same time strategically leaving the actual organization of the protest to the various groups who were organizing street protests. Interesting here is what we saw also is kind of what in marketing terms is being called a looping process. Yeah, I'll finish. So a looping process where they constantly took on the suggestions by users by looking at their comments systematically and by also frequently polling users for what they felt was important and what they needed to be doing. Feeding that also back in the language and images and activities associated with the brand. So this is an example of this, where they asked the users to produce selfies, which many of them reacted to. A strategy was later used during the Occupy protests. This is another one, the silent stands, which were suggested by one of the users. So just the two final points. These are really, it's a form of leadership which indeed works through what we call a looping process and branding this page. But it's also a very volatile type of leadership. It's one which is very vulnerable to being hijacked, which actually happened right after the start of the protests. So there were very clearly government agents active on the page, or at least regime supporters were active, who were constantly sort of criticizing and undermining the admins and calling them not Egyptian and agents of foreign regimes. So maybe we can talk about this later, but to close this, what this case study shows, I think, is how social media can be used to gain insights in new forms of protest organization and leadership. And of course, this data can then also be used for other types of purposes. For example, by tracing developments in popular sentiment, or to look in online practices of citizenship, which are particularly intriguing in an authoritarian context. Yet at the same time, I've tried to show in the first half of the talk how such insights need to be properly developed through a critical understanding of the opportunities and limits of social media data and of the technological infrastructures through which such data are generated and accessed. And that requires an active critical dialogue with this infrastructure and these data sets. Thank you very much for your attention.